Though he lived in the 13th century, religious maverick Meister Eckhart's teachings were in many ways modern. So much so that best-selling author and preeminent scholar Matthew Fox believes they hold the answer to many of the problems that we face today. I recently had the opportunity to sit down and talk to Matthew about his new book, Meister Eckhart, a mystic warrior for our times. I hope that you'll enjoy the interview. At what point in your life did you first discover Meister Eckhart's work, and what most originally drew you to his teachings?
Well, I'd already studied with the Dominicans over 12 years and never heard his name once, even though he was a Dominican. I studied in Paris for 3 years, and I'd heard his name occasionally, but not very much. But it was after I had my doctorate and everything, I picked up a book by Coomaraswamy, the Hindu philosopher, and then it was a whole chapter on Eckhart, and the book was on nature and art. Mm. And he actually says that reading Eckhart is like reading the Upanishads, which is great praise coming from a Hindu. Yeah. So, but in that article, there were sentences in Eckhart that I had published the year before, never having read Eckhart. Straight sentences from my own thinking.
Wow.
And that really freaked me out, actually. I put the book on a shelf and didn't look back at it for several months. Then I went gingerly back and I said, wow, I found someone who agrees with me. That's what wisdom is, isn't it? Someone who agrees with you. And so that's when I really went into Eckhart in a deeper way. And then I was in a serious car accident, and they did an operation on my back, and during the operation, Eckhart came to me in a dream. And we went walking together on the beach in silence, but it was the most transcendent dream of my life. So there was a bond there, too, with Eckhart.
I love that. Wow. Wow.
Plus our stories had some parallels, seeing as he was a Dominican, and he was not beloved by the Pope either.
Right, that's actually one of the things I was going to ask you about. So he was put on trial and condemned, and you also became an Episcopal priest after you were expelled from the Catholic Church. So can you tell us what happened in both of those cases, and if you think that those splits are key pieces to both of your paths as spiritual teachers?
Well, for Eckhart, of course, it happened right after he died. So his life was already done. Obviously, the papacy in the Middle Ages is different from the papacy in our time. And being condemned in your time, while you still have some years left, is ironically a way to get the word out there more fully. Mm. So, so I was kind of blessed in that regard because it increased my visibility rather than decreasing it, and especially because the papacy back then, before this present pope, was obviously very dark and was condemning people right and left. And so it's a bit of a badge of honor to be condemned by the papacies of John Paul II and Cardinal Ratzinger. But I've tried to wear the badge lightly and humbly. Mm. He stood for the women's movement of his day, the Beguines. They were very controversial. In fact, the Pope that condemned Eckhart condemned the Beguines 17 different times. Out damn spot. Obviously, it wasn't working. He supported women, and he supported the peasants, because he was the first intellectual to preach in the dialect of the peasants, which is what German was at that time. And so he was clearly on the side of the oppressed. And this is the real reason that his work angered the powers that be, and who condemned him. And the list of problems that the Cardinal Ratzinger had with my thinking, the first objection was that I'm a feminist theologian. I didn't know that was a heresy. Second, that I call God Mother. Well, I prove all the medieval mystics call God Mother. And other things like work too closely with Native Americans, and I don't condemn homosexuals and so forth. So it really reads like a Rorschach test of the papacy. It really has nothing to do with solid thinking or theology. So it was highly political, as was Eckhart's condemnation.
So in the introduction to the book, you write, Eckhart speaks to the deepest in the human condition. He calls forth the mystic and prophet, the contemplative and the activist in all of us. He holds secrets to many of today's pressing problems of conscience, consciousness, and culture. So why is Eckhart important to us today, and what present-day problems can his perspective help us with?
Well, I think Eckhart is uncanny in both his depth and his breadth. And therefore, he's a perfect model for a time of interfaith like ours, because it's pretty clear to me that our species needs to suck all the wisdom it can from all of its traditions. No one tradition has all the answers. If it did, we wouldn't be in the trouble we're in today, and the earth wouldn't be in the trouble it's in today. So Eckhart is uncanny, and this whole book is really designed around that. So there's a chapter on Eckhart and Judaism, Rabbi Heschel, a chapter on Eckhart and science, Teilhard and Thomas Berry, Eckhart and Buddhism, Thich Nhat Hanh, Eckhart and Hinduism, Eckhart and Sufism, Eckhart and the Divine Feminine, Eckhart and Indigenous. So, and then of course, a chapter on Carl Jung, because Jung owed so much to Eckhart and said so. He said he was the key to the unconscious to Eckhart, among other things. So there's a breadth to Eckhart that's breathtaking, a breadth that's breathtaking. And I don't know another thinker, really, who has this kind of impact on people. So this is terribly important for our time, that we get to the depths of our own wisdom, whatever tradition or non-tradition we come from. And Eckhart also has a lot to say to atheists, because Eckhart said, I pray God to rid me of God. And a lot of atheists are simply people who are rejecting the theisms, the God language that they have heard around them, and they're looking for another version of divinity too, in a way. And Eckhart was certainly that kind of person. So I think his time has come.
Publishers Weekly said that your book not only offers an excellent introduction to Eckhart's theology, but is also an inspirational guidepost for connecting faith with activism. Why is it important that we make that connection, and how can we begin to do so in our individual lives?
Well, you know, the Dalai Lama gave a talk a year or two ago to his Buddhist monks, and he said, we Buddhists, he said, we're great at talking about compassion and meditating on compassion, but we should imitate the Christians more in practicing compassion. Now, I'm glad the Dalai Lama has met some good Christians. I'm glad to hear that, but I couldn't agree more. Not that we imitate Christians, but we practice compassion.
Yes.
It's not enough to meditate on it. We're not living in a time, things are coming to a real boil regarding whether our species is sustainable or not, and whether the planet is going to survive in its present form or not. So time's running out, and we can't afford contemplatives just staying in monasteries. We have to be activists, but working out of a contemplative awareness,
yes,
out of love and out of justice and kindness. And clearly you can see everywhere with all the wars going on in the Middle East and so forth, that zeal and the reptilian brain is still leading. Mm-hmm. If we can calm the reptilian brain, and that's what contemplation does, meditation does, then we can be effectively compassionate again. But Jesus, you know, what can I say? He was an activist. Not exclusively, he worked out of his contemplative side as well. But he was not content just staying in the desert in solitude. And I think that we all need this combination of what I call the serenity of the Buddha and the impatience of Jesus and the Jewish prophets. Mm-hmm. We need to rediscover the holiness of patience and impatience. And there's a discernment process that you have to make. And we have to be impatient with the Supreme Court that tells us that that money is free speech, and that a billionaire spending untold millions on on promoting a particular politician has an equal voice to a working person who has only one vote at the ballot box. It's crazy.
Yeah.
And so we have to stand up and be heard. And we have to put our creativity into gear to create new forms of everything: education, worship, economics, politics, business, so that actually the future generations will prosper and thrive.